Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you find yourself. Welcome. I'm Scott Kennedy, the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at CSIS, and welcome to this CSIS event, The Erosion of Hong Kong's Autonomy Since 2020, Implications for the United States, which also is the title of a new report co-written by my colleagues Lily McElwee, Jude Blanchette, and myself. The events of 2019 and 2020 in Hong Kong are seared into everyone's consciousness. Protests and reaction to the proposed extradition law galvanized the city's population and was met eventually with a central government initiated national security law for Hong Kong, which was in turn met with sanctions by the United States and others. Much of the world's attention since then is turned away from Hong Kong due to COVID, the war in Ukraine, fears about a potential war in the Taiwan Strait, and the broader China challenge. Last year, my colleagues and I decided that it was time to return to Hong Kong and conduct a stock taking to look at the extent of both the resilience of autonomy and its erosion. So we went in September for an extended research trip and conducted almost 36 interviews with current officials, former officials, the business community, investors, scholars, journalists, and NGOs. And our report looks at the balance of resilience and erosion of autonomy, and on that basis evaluates the policy options for the United States. I want to thank several people and groups who helped with our work and this report. My co-authors, Lily and Jude, our teams in the Freeman Chair and the Trustee Chair, CSIS's publications team. We're also grateful to all the people that we interviewed in Hong Kong, as well as to the U.S. State Department for supporting this project. Today's program is divided into 3 parts. We'll first have opening remarks from the U.S. Consul General in Hong Kong, Gregory May. And then there'll be a brief presentation of the report's key findings by Lily, Jude, and myself. And then we'll finish up with a roundtable discussion with several top experts on Hong Kong: Hanscom Smith, Kelley Loper, Andrew Dowell, and Zhang. Those watching live can submit questions via the event webpage on the CSIS website. So let's get started. Let me introduce our opening speaker. Gregory May is the United States Consul General in Hong Kong and Macau, having arrived at the post in September of 2022. Prior to serving in Hong Kong, he was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, and also served as Consul General in Shenyang, Northeast China. Mr. May has 2 prior assignments in China at the U.S. Consul General in Guangzhou and at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. In Washington, he worked as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs and held various positions focused on China, Vietnam, and the State Department's Executive Secretariat. And prior to entering the U.S. Foreign Service, he was the Assistant Director and Research Associate in Chinese Studies at the Nixon Center, and also was a journalist for International Community Radio Taipei and Newsweek. So, Consul General May, welcome to our program. Thank you for your service to the United States, and we look forward to your remarks. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. Thank you for inviting me back to CSIS. Good evening to everyone. Good evening from Hong Kong. I really appreciate CSIS for its engagement on Hong Kong issues, which are very, very important, including the forum that we're at right now, but also the report that you released this week. The last time I spoke to CSIS, it was in January 2023. I was very new to Hong Kong. I'd been here for less than 6 months. Today, I'd like to share my impressions after a little bit more time, over 1.5 years, and explain current U.S. policy priorities. I often describe the U.S. relationship with Hong Kong as having 3 components. And the first component is a very good people-to-people relationship. The second component is our productive business and trade cooperation with Hong Kong. And finally, the third component is the most challenging, and that's our political relationship with the Hong Kong government. And it's in this area where we have severe differences regarding human rights and the PRC's violation of its treaty obligations with respect to Hong Kong. We have an overall interest, the United States does, in stabilizing our relationship with the PRC, and this includes stabilizing our relationship with Hong Kong. If authorities in Hong Kong return to respecting the spirit and letter of the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, the US government would be prepared to respond positively to that. And let me say here at the top of my remarks that the United States is going to continue to urge authorities to withdraw the arrest bounties that have been put on democracy activists overseas. This includes 1 US citizen and 4 US residents. We will continue to call for the release of Jimmy Lai, the NSL 47, and the many others in Hong Kong who are currently in detention for their peaceful expression of political views. Turning back to the 3 components, I mentioned the first component, our very good people-to-people relationship with Hong Kongers. Maintaining our friendship with the people of Hong Kong remains our top priority. And this is where I have focused the greatest amount of my time as Consul General here. Hong Kong is in the top 25 sources of international students in the United States, with nearly 6,000 Hong Kong students enrolled currently at American universities. We're very proud of this number. Of course, there's room to grow, and I've spent a lot of my time promoting education in the United States. But we also want to encourage American students to come here. This is another area where we could grow. Hong Kong is a great place for American students to study the Chinese language, whether that's Mandarin or the Cantonese dialect, which I am working hard to study with some mixed results. Hong Kong is also an amazing place to study and understand China's culture and history. Everywhere I go in Hong Kong, I meet Hong Kongers who graduated from US universities. They have their children in the United States or other relatives, and they travel back and forth very frequently. These Hong Kongers want to maintain the city's deep ties to the United States and to the rest of the world. And it's these people-to-people ties that are going to continue to be the crucial ballast in the US-Hong Kong relationship for some time to come. The second component, business and trade. This has remained largely unchanged, Scott, since the last time I spoke with you in 2023. The number of US companies in Hong Kong is still just under 1,300, and that's neither significantly increased nor decreased. And many Americans would be surprised to learn that Hong Kong itself, with a relatively small population, it's a very large market for US products. And our two-way trade in goods and services went up last year. It's at 59 billion US dollars, and that includes a 25 billion US dollar surplus for the United States. In my time here, I've continued to speak with every business person that I can meet with, and not just from the United States, but all over the world, including China, about their experiences here in Hong Kong. I do want to emphasize I do not present myself as speaking on behalf of the American business community. I simply am relaying several common themes that continue to emerge from my conversations here. The first very strong impression is US companies remain deeply invested in Hong Kong, and American firms want to stay here and continue to do business here. But the companies are concerned, as individuals are concerned, about some of the uncertainties created by the political changes. This includes the recently passed Safeguarding National Security Ordinance, which is popularly known as the Article 23 legislation. The Article 23 ordinance includes some vaguely defined provisions regarding sedition, state secrets, external interference, and all of these raise questions. I think firms are looking very closely at how internet freedom and data regulations are developing here. They're watching the authorities in Hong Kong have this very, very singular focus on national security. And at the same time, Hong Kong authorities have stated they plan to introduce cybersecurity legislation later this year. So there's a lot of question marks out there. This week, just yesterday, the appeals court ruling upholding the government's ban on the protest song Glory to Hong Kong is concerning because clearly Hong Kong authorities have stepped onto that slippery slope of trying to censor some content on the internet. And it begs the question, you know, where is this going to end? Where are the lines going to be drawn in this space? Regarding the importance of free information flow, Scott, I would like to note that Hong Kong leaders recently announced that they are going to pause plans for a fake news law. This is something I raised in my remarks in 2023. I think their plans to pause it is a piece of good news that should be acknowledged. All that said, with or without a fake news law here, Hong Kong's media is under increasing control and restrictions on what they can report. That's very evident when you're here week to week, month to month. The media space is definitely contracting. I do believe companies and individuals would very much appreciate a stronger and clear assurance by Hong Kong authorities that the internet is going to remain basically free and open. That's one of Hong Kong's biggest advantages over mainland China. They want assurances that Hong Kong is going to avoid the type of restrictive data controls that make life very difficult for foreign companies in mainland China. I believe that Hong Kong wants to remain a very competitive place and maintain a very competitive environment, but I think they could say more explicitly what their plans in this space are. And then lastly, I'm going to turn to the third component, the political relationship. As I mentioned, this is where most of the challenges and differences lie. As I said, the United States is interested in stabilizing our relationship here, but this will require Hong Kong leaders to stop the slide toward ever greater repression. I note that the backsliding here on rights and freedoms, it's not just a concern of the United States alone. And many countries, and most recently we saw the G7 foreign ministers, they've spoken very forcefully about the changes here in Hong Kong. I already mentioned the US government's concern for Jimmy Lai, but it's important to remember that hundreds of other Hong Kongers remain in detention, and some of them are awaiting potentially very harsh sentences simply for the peaceful expression of political views. And the United States will be closely watching the expected verdicts later this month of the several NSL 47 defendants, and then their sentencing later this year. Sadly, Hong Kong authorities are now attempting to limit freedom of expression outside of Hong Kong's borders. And Scott, I can tell you that nothing has done more damage to the US-Hong Kong relationship during my tenure here than an attempt by Hong Kong police to extraterritorially enforce the national security law within the borders of the United States. This transnational repression through the use of bounties and intimidation of US citizens and US residents is unacceptable. And last month, Secretary Blinken announced that the United States is imposing new visa restrictions on Hong Kong officials engaging in this type of crackdown on rights and freedoms. Hong Kong leaders frequently complain about what they often call soft resistance. That is like Hong Kongers seeking quiet ways to show dissatisfaction with government policies. And frankly, what I have seen in my still limited time here has been authorities' increasing use of pressure outside the legal system to curtail freedoms that Hong Kongers once enjoyed. And I would call this soft repression. You see soft repression in the difficulty that some legally registered groups have in organizing fundraising events, for example. When restaurants and hotels make last-second excuses for why their facilities are no longer available. You see this when a prominent political cartoonist is suddenly and with no explanation unable to publish his work. So the international community, is rightly focused on the damage to rights and freedoms done by the national security law and are watching very closely Article 23. I think that's absolutely correct. But I would argue that this self-censorship and authorities' soft repression are arguably doing just as much to chip away at Hong Kong's vibrancy, openness, and rule of law. All of this said, and I have by necessity focused much of my remarks on the concerns the US government has, I would like to end with a note of optimism. It is the resilience of the Hong Kong people that I've been so struck with and should give us all hope for the future. Even in very difficult circumstances, so many Hong Kongers are working hard where they can to restore and preserve the many things that make Hong Kong a special place and a city that I truly enjoy living in. Hong Kong's unique language, its culture, its DNA of openness and inclusiveness. It's its greatest asset. And Hong Kongers, and this includes Hong Kongers who disagree with U.S. policies, they continue to be very welcoming to myself personally, to my fellow diplomats here at the consulate, and of course to Americans in general. Last year, our consulate celebrated its 180th anniversary in Hong Kong, and we're determined to stay here for another 2 centuries and beyond. And so no matter what the future holds, the United States is going to remain fully engaged in Hong Kong. So thank you again. Thank you for letting me speak at the top of this important event. Congratulations to CSIS on the report. I read it. I think it has a lot of very interesting observations and recommendations. So I commend CSIS for its good work there.
Well, CG May, thank you very much for those opening remarks. Extremely thoughtful. If you would let me ask a couple questions, I'd really appreciate it. I know those watching would also welcome your additional thoughts. You know, when we were in Hong Kong and when we've continued the conversation with officials in Hong Kong since we returned, I think if you want to, the thing they get most upset about and indignant about is the accusation that they don't have decision-making authority and autonomy to guide Hong Kong's future. Most recently, with the Article 23 ordinance, we have heard a variety of explanations and justifications with the people we spoke with emphasizing the ordinance's careful construction, the consultation process, the due process guarantees in the law, their emphasis that other countries have similar kinds of laws, that Hong Kong is no different now from many other countries around the world. How do you see those things?
Well, I think the first thing, to emphasize is the national security law from 2020, did the damage, made the fundamental changes. On Article 23, we're going to need to wait and see how it's applied. I leave it to Hong Kongers to judge whether the process, the consultation period and the very rapid review in the LegCo and the unanimous passing of it in LegCo reflected opinions in Hong Kong. You did see several Hong Kong groups participate in the consultation and raise their concerns, some of the same concerns that I touched upon in my remarks. From my perspective, what's challenging is we just see the pendulum in Hong Kong moving in one direction towards more national security, more repressive policies. And what I really hoped to happen was to see a swing back to more openness. And I think a lot of Hong Kongers want that too. There's been a lot of national security and they would like to go back to the kind of normal state of being of Hong Kong being a super connector, super open and confident in embracing the world. If that pendulum swings back, that would just be helpful for everyone. It would be helpful for our relationship with Hong Kong.
Well, let's go to talk more about that, the pendulum. What would be 2 or 3 things that would be signals of that pendulum swinging back in the other direction? Small, large, what should the international community, Americans, Washington, be looking for to know whether the pendulum is swinging back in the other direction?
We in Washington are looking very closely at the transnational repression that I mentioned in my remarks, that does not continue. I think the reassurances on internet freedom, again, this is the key: one country, 2 systems. The difference that the internet still is relatively free and open and works well here, and you don't need a VPN to use it. That's a huge advantage for Hong Kong, but there's some now question marks over that. Stopping the slide of what I said, the pendulum, doubling and tripling down on these very hard policies. But again, I want to emphasize here on a positive, note, is that if we see a change of course, we're very open to doing what we can to try to get on a better footing and a better relationship with Hong Kong.
Well, on that positive, hopeful note, let me express our thanks to you for joining us today. and for all of the work that you do in trying to address issues in Hong Kong and with regard to U.S.-China relations.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and please come back to Hong Kong soon.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, with that note, let me now turn things over to my colleague, Lily McElwee, and then Jude, who will start us off summarizing the key findings of our report. Lily, and over to you.
Thank you, Scott. So for those of you who have not yet read our report, I encourage you all to do so. But this morning, we wanted to provide a little bit of a summary of the report, its key findings, and its key policy recommendations. So before turning over to my colleagues, Jude and Scott, I wanted to discuss the stakes here and the importance of Hong Kong to the United States, which I think the Consul General just did very persuasively. But let me add a few points. So we run through this history in the report, but just as background, pursuant to the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration and subsequent basic law, the central government in Beijing committed to allow Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy for at least 50 years. And for 2 decades after Hong Kong returned to Chinese control in 1947, it did enjoy this relatively high degree of autonomy characterized by open markets, judicial independence, rule of law, and the free flow of information. And this is even after China, under Xi Jinping, took a more pronounced authoritarian turn beginning in 2013. This autonomy not only facilitated Hong Kong's prosperity and its fantastic success as a global business hub, but it meant that Hong Kong really served as a gateway between the United States and the rest of the People's Republic of China across trade, investment, finance, travel, and the legal domains. And US policy toward Hong Kong has long reflected this autonomy, this promise of autonomy, and sought to encourage it. The 1992 US Hong Kong Policy Act gave the US government authority to treat Hong Kong as distinct from the rest of China in a variety of domains: trade, finance, immigration, other fields, based on this assumption that Beijing was committed to maintaining the city's autonomy through 2047. I think based on the findings of our report, which Jude will go into very soon, it's quite clear that this transition period is over prematurely through developments that intensified in the mid 2010s. But just taking a snapshot from today, and the Consul General helped in this regard as well, despite developments of the past years, the US and Hong Kong still have very deep ties and very strong ties across a variety of domains. In trade, Hong Kong is the 15th largest export market for the United States. It's one of the top destinations for US consumer products. Plenty of American firms continue to operate in Hong Kong, although that number has fallen in past years consecutively. Still over 1,200 US firms operate in Hong Kong. About 214 have their regional headquarters in Hong Kong. And as the Consul General mentioned, people-to-people ties are still very strong. There are about 250,000 Hong Kong-born immigrants in the United States, and according to the latest Hong Kong Policy Act report, there are about 84,000 Americans living in Hong Kong, which is back up again after dipping during the COVID pandemic and associated lockdowns. And I think what the Consul General made clear in his remarks and what interviews conducted for this report also clarified is that many Hong Kongers from across the spectrum, from more pro-establishment figures to the pro-democracy camp, place a very high value on a strong relationship with the United States. So as a consequence of all these ties, Washington sustains an important stake in the city's future, and US policy toward Hong Kong remains rooted in this determination to support Hong Kong's autonomy, prosperity, its way of life, to protect the American citizens and firms who are resident and operate in Hong Kong, and to promote the human rights and democratic freedoms of Hong Kong's residents. So our report seeks to identify how best to do that, given evolving political and governance developments on the mainland, but also an ever-evolving situation on the ground in Hong Kong, which Jude will turn to next. So Jude, over to you.
Great, thank you, Lily. And I know we've got about 35 minutes left, and we have 4 amazing panelists sort of sitting off to the digital side. So let me be mercilessly brief in my remarks, in large part because the bulk of the analysis can be found in the report, and also helpfully by a short audio summary that colleague Scott Kennedy has provided. But I'll just say, I think one of the aspects which Scott and I on our trip to Hong Kong last year, and then in subsequent discussions, found most striking was less the quantifiable deterioration and slide, which is in many ways evident as indicated by some of the court cases that Consul General May mentioned, as well as some of the de jure restrictions and security architecture that has been put in place under the 2020 National Security Law, and more recently under the Article 23. But what was most striking is really the sort of soft constraints and decrease in autonomy, which are harder to quantify, but are just evident by a rewiring of incentive structures in and around the city, whether that's in academia, in media, in elements of free speech. It is the uncertainty and fear of potential repercussions that is leading to self-censorship, to meetings not taken and not agreed to that ordinarily would have been quite banal and normal. It's the article that isn't written for a publication because of a fear of whether that will or will not transgress, not even necessarily on the de jure letter of the law, but more just the climate of national security and fear. And this, of course, going back to the literature on autocratic systems, is one of the most, quote unquote, effective way that you govern a society is not through formal de jure constraints, but is in fact on this sort of soft element where individuals in a system just don't know what the boundaries are anymore. And so Scott and I did not include in the report, but in many instances where we were you could feel in a conversation how restricted the conversation was compared to what we might have expected just a few years earlier. Individuals we talked to on academic campuses talking about a new sort of culture of fear and self-censorship and reprisal, where colleagues would potentially spike promotions or tenure grantings because they didn't like an individual's position on Hong Kong or the mainland. This was just widespread and evident, and was one of the important reasons why visiting Hong Kong is going to be an important component of assessments moving forward, is because there's not always data for all of this. Second, I think thing that was evident, and this is quantifiable, is just how much Hong Kong's direction of travel now feels like it is under the explicit shadow of a changing political culture in the mainland. If you look at the public consultation document on the National Security Ordinance that was put out in the beginning of the year, there was, in its definition of national security, explicit references to Xi Jinping's concept of holistic national security, which I and Scott and others have written quite a great deal about, but is this sort of amorphous ideological description of national security that has emerged in mainland China since 2014, that at the center of it positions regime security as the foundation of national security. And what that does is it leaves a historically judicially independent rule of law city like Hong Kong unable to define national security on its own terms, and in some ways pegged to this evolving concept of national security as it's defined under Xi Jinping in the mainland China, which will always be a blurred line, because as we've seen in mainland China, what violates national security could be someone writing an essay on World War II that de-emphasizes the role of the Communist Party in fighting the Japanese, would be considered historical nihilism. Court cases have been brought against individuals in the mainland, and you can feel that this is the direction of travel in Hong Kong as well. There will always be a shifting idea of what national security is, and whereas some of the soothing scenarios we heard in our trip, and subsequently talk about the importance of Hong Kong being a common law system. And really, with the national security law and the Article 23 National Security Ordinance, we just need a little bit of time to have a few court cases, and that will essentially settle what this means. And that just doesn't feel credible, in part because there's not a fixed definition of national security up north. And that will always have a downstream effect on how Hong Kong navigates. So in conclusion, having lived in China for a decade, I would always go down to Hong Kong, and it would be this respite. It would be this environment where you could go listen to interesting talks about China's political system in salons. You could go to the many great bookstores and hoard your copies of biographies of Xi Zhongxun and other party elite. You would have you were in a media environment that was robust and vibrant and heterodox, and that has just very clearly and evidently changed in a dramatic manner just over the last 4 years. I'll turn it over to Scott by saying I think this rather pessimistic conclusion, though, really only gets the United States and policymakers, pardon the American football metaphor, but to about the 15-yard line. And as with our overall relationship with China, acknowledging the autocratic slide doesn't tell you exactly what you're supposed to do about this in light of protecting U.S. interests vis-a-vis mainland China and Hong Kong. And that really is the hard part. And so I will take the hard part and I will punt, to keep the football metaphors, and turn it over to my colleague, Scott Kennedy.
Well, thank you, Jude, and Lily, for collaborating on this project. It's been great to work with you, even though it's a difficult game and moving the ball down the field is not easy. Let me try to do that with regard to the policy discussion. But I want to first say, in all of the conversations that we've had in Hong Kong and since, some of the people that we spoke to thought Hong Kong is finally the city that they want. Conservative voices, and others, many others, were really quite worried and concerned about where Hong Kong has gone. And we encountered also a lot of bravery, a lot of courageousness, and really proud of the people that we met that are trying to operate in what they would consider an extremely difficult climate. On the policy side, U.S. policy towards Hong Kong is, as we see it, remains rooted in a determination to support Hong Kong's autonomy, prosperity, and way of life, to protect American individuals and firms in Hong Kong, and to promote the freedoms of Hong Kong's residents. We identified 3 options broadly conceived that the U.S. could adopt as a framework for policy. A punitive approach focused on sanctions as autonomy is lessened, an approach called resignation, which is basically giving up on Hong Kong and basically treating it as another mainland Chinese city, or strategic engagement and trying to interact effectively with the Hong Kong government and society to try and preserve as much autonomy as possible. Now, each of these approaches has pluses and minuses, and no one option makes obvious easy sense to choose. This is difficult. We concluded that although there will continue to potentially be need for some kinds of punitive actions and sanctions, we conclude, and again, it's a tough call, that there are important benefits from engagement with all elements in Hong Kong, with officials, with society, with businesses. And I want to highlight, though, that the need for an engagement approach with Hong Kong in many areas differs from the purpose of engagement that has been justified for a relationship with the broader People's Republic of China. With the latter, the goal has been to foster change and integration of China into the international system. With respect to Hong Kong, engagement is meant to protect the status quo, to slow change, to slow the erosion of autonomy, to maintain what is special about Hong Kong. The goal, as we see it, should be to protect what autonomy remains for as long as possible, to slow Hong Kong's slide into Beijing's arms and as another regular mainland Chinese city. We definitely believe that resignation, just giving up on Hong Kong, doesn't make much sense from a practical perspective, because what it would do is most likely accelerate the changes in Hong Kong that many do not want to see. Well, that's a summary of our report, both from why Hong Kong is important, what we saw when we were there and afterward in terms of the direction of change, and where American policy ought to go. We're now going to take a very, very short break while we get the panel settled in their seats, and then Jude and Lily will take things from there. We'll be back in just a second.
Welcome back, everyone. And now looking forward to spending the remainder of our time in conversation with a really fantastic panel to help us make sense of where Hong Kong is in 2024 and where it's likely to be headed. Joined by Hanscom Smith, who served as Greg's predecessor as Consul General in Hong Kong from summer of 2019 to the summer of 2022, so overlapping with a incredibly challenging, unique time in Hong Kong's history. Hanscom is now a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson School of Global Affairs, and probably his most important title is he is a non-resident at the Freeman Chair at CSIS. Also joined by Kelley Loper, who's a professor at University of Denver's Strum College of Law, and previously Kelley was an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong and brings deep experience and scholarly wisdom on Hong Kong's legal and judicial system. Also delighted to welcome Annie Zhang, who's a Nyman Fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center. Annie wears many, many hats, among which she was the founder and former editor of Initium Media, which was an online Chinese language publication established in Hong Kong in 2015. And last but certainly not least is Andrew Dowell, who spent a number of years as the Hong Kong-based Asia editor for the Wall Street Journal, and has now left Hong Kong to find an easier assignment in covering the Middle East as the journal's Middle East editor. So really excited and appreciative for your time this morning. And just for division of labor, I'm going to ask a few questions first to Hanscom and Kelley, and then Lily will ask a few questions and seek the insights of Annie and Andrew. So, Hanscom, I might start with you, if I may, in many ways, because you've been such a helpful mentor as Scott and Lily and I have been trying to think through this work. And so I might just sort of first ask you a higher level question. You came to Hong Kong in 2019, you left in 2022. I want just your high level assessment on where we are now in 2024. Where do you come down on the balance of this issue of how much of the two systems in the one country, two systems still obtains, and your sense of the sort of the direction of travel in Hong Kong?
Thank you, Jude. I think the fundamental shift that I observed on the ground is that after the handover in 1997, Hong Kong was seen by Beijing in many ways as an asset, an opportunity, and a model. It was also common ground in U.S.-China relations because there are so many common interests in fostering a vibrant and stable Hong Kong as a business hub. After the protests in 2019, Beijing started to view Hong Kong as a threat and a risk, both in terms of the political activity in Hong Kong itself and also as a facet of the U.S.-China relationship, which was deteriorating at the same time. So in that very difficult context, which I think results from a misreading of what motivated the protests, which were simply, in my experience, and I was on the ground for most of the protests, were the Hong Kong people's desires for autonomy. And that was often misread in Beijing as a desire for independence, which is a fringe position in Hong Kong and not at all the position of the United States government. So we've seen the overreaction, including through imposition of the national security law. It stems from, I think, both a lack of confidence and a misreading of what should be a great deal of common interest between the United States and China in Hong Kong. So I want to pick up on what the Consul General said regarding the importance of strategic engagement, and that is advancing America's interests on all three of the fronts that the Consul General mentioned, people to people, business and trade, and also the political imperative of Hong Kong's autonomy. Hong Kong is not like the mainland. Its autonomy has certainly been severely compromised. I think that the international community, including the United States, should continue to speak out or from a position of engagement and support for the Hong Kong people.
Just a follow-up question, Hanscom, if I may, which is just more narrowly, you engage with a lot of, you have and do engage with a lot of companies, investors who are on the ground there. You know the business environment well. We've heard from U.S. companies that while there's certainly been an effect of the national security law, it feels like it hasn't sort of scared companies en masse out of Hong Kong. Greg mentioned the fact that there's roughly 1,000 companies still there, which is neither a massive decrease or increase. This is obviously a leading question, but does that mean there's no effect to the national security law in the Article 23 on the business environment? Does that mean there's sort of a general shoulder shrug? Or do you get the sense that there is a effect, even if it isn't instantiated in a numerical drop of companies operating?
Yes, it's eroding Hong Kong's competitiveness as a hub. Before, I think one of Hong Kong's strengths was simply the certainty and predictability of the business environment. While in my experience, American and other foreign companies remain committed to Hong Kong, they're much less certain about the operating environment. And again, that should be one of Hong Kong's, traditionally has been one of Hong Kong's greatest assets. And all of the efforts to repress Hong Kong's social and political autonomy ultimately are also undermining the city's viability as a business hub.
Kelley, if I could turn to you now, and this is a closely related issue because certainly companies operate within a system of regulatory and legal guidelines. But I wanted to first ask you similarly a high-level question on the independence and professionalism of the courts. It's hard with a lot of these things to have a yardstick for autonomy that you can sort of hold up against a given institution and say it's moved 2 centimeters to the left or the right. But sort of as a high level question, what's your personal assessment on the degree of autonomy that still obtains in Hong Kong? And then I've got a more sort of specific question to follow up on that.
Sure. Thank you, Jude. And also congratulations to you, Lily and Scott, on producing this really wonderful, very important report at this time. I agree that with your assessment that the national security law, Article 23 legislation, changes to the political system, et cetera, have all really had an impact on judicial independence as a key component of Hong Kong's autonomy, and certainly eroded and undermined efforts by judges, lawyers, and others to actually achieve any real human rights protection and to maintain this level of autonomy. But I also just want to say that I really appreciated your observations of the pockets of resilience, or spots of resilience, I think is the term that you used in the report. And I know that, you know, judges and lawyers many are really doing their best in this very challenging environment. I think many judges, you know, they are walking a fine line. They're in an incredibly difficult position, and in particularly politically sensitive areas, it is very difficult. I think it's you have to read the details of the judgments to really fully understand the reasoning and what might be missing in order to answer questions around judicial independence. But I do think that a lot of the engagement, and I also appreciate the report's conclusions that engagement and strategic engagement is incredibly important. But much of this engagement, I think, needs to happen in areas that are less politically sensitive, but still involve fundamental human rights issues. And I think there are quite a few examples, and some of these are mentioned in your report, of human rights issues, real human rights issues, so LGBT rights, other minority rights, where there's a lot of possibility for the courts to actually achieve progressive outcomes. And I think it's very important to remember that and try to find ways to support judges, to support lawyers in adjudicating these cases, judicially reviewing these issues. There have been 2 cases in the last year and a half where the Court of Final Appeal has ruled against the government on LGBT rights. And, you know, those are big wins. And these are fundamental rights, the right to privacy based on international human rights standards. The courts are still drawing on international human rights law for guidance and comparative human rights law. So I think to the extent that we can try to expand the human rights and continue the human rights discourse, even if this is sort of seems insufficient or isn't very satisfying, entirely satisfying, I think it's important to try to do this as much as possible in these somewhat less politically sensitive areas that don't immediately trigger national security concerns, at least from the government's perspective.
Just as a follow-up, Kelley, and I don't think this will change the answer you just gave, but maybe as maybe an answer that can provide a bit of a framework for those of us who don't follow the judicial system as closely as you. How should we situate individual rulings that seem to affirm the concern folks have about the direction of travel? I'm thinking, just in the last 24 hours, we've seen the courts in Hong Kong affirm the government's position on the song "Glory to Hong Kong," and now giving the government the power, overturning an initial ruling, and now giving the government the power to potentially compel internet platforms like Google to censor it. How do you think about that? I know you haven't looked too deeply into this. It just happened. We probably haven't read the ruling yet, but just at a surface level, how do you think about that case, and how should we as external observers, when Jimmy Lai is, I think, inevitably going to be found guilty, right? I don't think that's a question, but the fact that I think we know inevitably he's going to be found guilty raises some questions about how much judicial independence there is. So just help us think through how we should situate individual court cases.
Okay, well, I mean, the decision yesterday by the Court of Appeal is unfortunate. And I think the Court of First Instance decision against the government in relation to the Glory to Hong Kong song was one of the examples that you provided in your report of this, the spots of resilience that I just mentioned. And so it seems, to obviously go in the other direction. But of course, I mean, this is how the judicial system works in Hong Kong. Cases are heard at different levels. It's not entirely clear to me if this is the end of the road for these issues, whether the Court of Final Appeal might have a chance to consider the arguments in this case, whether there might be a different perspective coming from the Court of Final Appeal. But again, I think the Court of Final Appeal is in a very difficult position because any of their decisions could be reinterpreted by the National People's Congress Standing Committee. And that's got to always be not even in the back of the judges' minds, but in the forefront of how they proceed in some of these cases. And I do think, I mean, not that many national security cases have actually reached the Court of Final Appeal. It's interesting as a legal scholar to watch how all of this plays out and how, the court is, I believe, trying very hard to maintain judicial independence, trying to balance all of these interests in creative ways in order not to invoke this reaction from Beijing, from the National People's Congress Standing Committee, but also reiterate the importance of human rights in various contexts. So I think, we have to watch this space. I'm not entirely optimistic. I'm not entirely surprised with the Court of Appeal's decision. And as I said before, these, are extremely politically sensitive issues. And, there is this sort of area of Hong Kong law in the national security space that probably isn't going, we're probably not going to get very far. And when it comes to human rights or fundamental rights like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, etc., this is going to be very difficult when the government perceives that there are national security risks at issue. But again, I just really do think it's important not to forget and to keep supporting Hong Kong advocates, lawyers, judges as much as possible, and particularly identifying these pockets of resilience and space for engagement that won't incur, the wrath of Beijing quite as much. I mean, I just talked to a lawyer last week who based in Hong Kong who said to me, "Please don't give up on Hong Kong." And I think it's really important for all of us to remember that.
Great, excellent insights and perspective. Thank you, Kelley, and thank you, Hanscom. Lily, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jude. So in the time we have left, I think we're going to move from the legal, political, business environment to discuss the media and publishing environment. And we're delighted this morning to be joined by two esteemed journalists previously based for a long time in Hong Kong, Annie Zhang and Andrew Dowell. Annie, I'm going to start with you, but Andrew, I'll ask you a similar question. So one trend we document in the report is that while Hong Kong continues to have higher media freedom than in mainland China, this freedom is really on a downward trend due to both formal restrictions on accessibility of information and acceptable speech and acceptable topics for coverage. Some outlets have been shut down, but also due to a growing climate of fear and self-censorship, in the sense that journalists are self-selecting to steer clear of topics that the Hong Kong government or Beijing could deem sensitive. I think the Consul General mentioned this trend of soft repression. So Annie, let me start with you. Given your long tenure as a journalist in Hong Kong and your extensive experience in the Hong Kong media space, how do you see these changes? Do the trends that we document in the report line up with your lived experience?
Yeah, thank you, Lily. Regarding the media, I mainly agree with what the report mentioned. I think despite the facing suppression and the rapid decline compared to the past, to Hong Kong's past, the situation of press freedom in Hong Kong still remains qualitatively different from that in mainland China. And I will try to build on maybe 3 or 4 small points first, the background, I think the background of internet freedom is totally different, and it's important. Hong Kong still remains essentially a region with internet freedom comparing to the long-standing operation of Great Firewall in China, in mainland China. So this allows for a fundamentally different landscape of the production and this dissemination of news. So, and also, secondly, I think there's the difference between interesting metaphor, the whitelist and the blacklist systems. So you can understand that mainland China operates like under a strict whitelist system for news reporting. Only institutions on the whitelist are qualified to report news, meaning that only the institutions belong to the party have these qualifications. But however, in Hong Kong, even after 2020, it's still possible to freely register and establish media outlets and publishing houses. So the only entities restricted are the government press conferences, but I think it's not that important. So the general interviews and the reporting can still be conducted by anyone. I think this is one of the basic differences. And also there is the distinction between the restraint before interview and the subsequent punishment. So like in mainland China, news reporting operates under the long-standing verbal and written prior restraint orders due to the authorities. Reporters often receive the orders prohibiting coverage of certain events before they even leave for interviews or the newspapers publish. But for Hong Kong, the situation in Hong Kong, there is no such control system for news reporting. Instead, maybe the National Security or Police Department can only pursue subsequent punishment for the content of reports. And also, I think another point is important is from the China's new the journalism, the red lines in China's news reporting are drawn primarily around events. So if a certain event is prohibited from being reported, under almost everything about that event is forbidden. But even under the national security law, the things in Hong Kong, the red lines, the so-called red lines in Hong Kong's media is very implicit. So there are no events that are completely off limits for reporting. Even the trial of Jimmy Lai or the June 4th anniversary can still be reported by the media. And of course, the reporters themselves will strictly adhere to the national security law to minimize the risk, but still the events itself are not forbidden. So, but I think the similarity between two regions is rather the self-censorship and the fair, of course, and also like the Consul General said just now, the soft repression or soft threats to individual journalists and the visa restrictions are common tactics used by Chinese government. So especially for those foreign media journalists holding Chinese passports with families still in China, with this kind of situation making them easily controllable and in a very risky way. So, but in fact, because of all these kind of differences, I think the space for news reporting or professional journalism is still very big in Hong Kong, but the space for expressing opinions in Hong Kong is most affected. So if you so you can still if the journalist can break through kind of self-censorship, there is still significant room for professional journalism. That's why that you can see legacy media from the West still have a relatively large space to operate in Hong Kong. And the last point I want to make is, yeah, it's in fact even after the national security law over the past 4 years, we still can see the establishment of new small-scale media outlets in Hong Kong. They refer themselves to as mosquito media, consisting of teams around 1 to 10 people targeting a niche angle of news reporting. So following the closure of Apple Daily in 2021, I think nearly 10 or 15 small-scale media outlets with a certain readership emerged, focusing on court reporting, investigative reporting, lifestyle, and all kinds of things. So I think, yeah, we have the room for professional journalism still exists, and we should expand it. But of course, the room for opinion, it's very difficult. And also in the long run, the entire ecosystem has the irreversible damage. That's evident.
Thank you, Annie, for those really insightful remarks into the media and publishing space. There's lots more to dig into there, but I want to hand over to Andrew. Thank you for your patience, Andrew. You moved very recently to cover the Middle East, but before that, you were covering Hong Kong for 7 years, a very pivotal period of changes on the ground and in the media and publishing environment. Want to ask a similar question. How did your work evolve on the ground across that period? Any major turning points in your experience?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for having me. I think Angie's on the money that there are Annie, sorry, is on the money that there are still very significant distinctions between operating in Hong Kong and operating on the mainland. On the mainland, during the time that I was here, we had 10 journalists expelled for a variety of reasons, some for coverage, some as a result of diplomatic disputes with the U.S., and we continue to face kind of significant restrictions on our visa availability there, which limits our presence on the mainland. You also have, I think if you talk to foreign journalists, you will know that, or you will hear that, there's kind of heavy interaction with state security and other government officials on even benign reporting trips. Hong Kong is very different from that. We still get visas pretty predictably. The process might be getting a little bit more extensive and onerous, particularly since the introduction of the national security law in 2020. But we are able to operate here and come in and out of here in a way that we certainly aren't on the mainland. I just speaking for the English language foreign press, I will say, I think there's a feeling out there that like journalists are trying to find where the red lines are and how to, cover things and kind of thread the needle. And I will say in our case, that's really not true. I mean, we cover what we think we need to cover. And if we get to the position that we don't think that we can cover it, then we'll have to make a decision to leave or something. So it's, I don't think we're at the point where we don't think we can do what we need to do there. We are, as an organization, probably more risk averse than others, particularly because of the the detention in Russia more than a year ago of Evan Gershkovich, one of our reporters, while on assignment in Ekaterinburg. And it does make you think. I don't think Hong Kong is a sort of situation where we have tremendous concerns about that. There are distinctions in the legal system where it's more transparent. It's very different to be arrested in Hong Kong than it is to be arrested in Russia or in mainland China. And that does matter. So I think there, in some ways, it's kind of, full steam ahead. On the other hand, however, it has been more difficult to do substantive work in Hong Kong, and not because of restrictions or self-censorship, but just on the availability of reasonable discourse. The commentary and the availability of the government to understand their perspective and to be able to really interview them and test their ideas has kind of evaporated. The level of public discourse has become a lot less nuanced. In fact, there's no nuance, and it's become pretty base. There's not criticism, there's smearing. I think you see government officials kind of almost falling over each other to advance what they think is the mainland view in many cases, and it's become more, and you have this difficulty even with officials to say where the laws begin and end. So questions like, I mean, these are almost silly to even bring up, but like, can you get in trouble for what you're saying in confession, or can you get in trouble for holding old copies of Apple Daily? I mean, it's just the government has a very difficult time saying reasonable things on a lot of these positions. So I guess what I'm saying is your ability to have kind of a sophisticated discussion about some of these laws and about some of the policies has been eroded in large part because of the unwillingness of one side to engage in a sophisticated manner on these issues. So the one thing I will say is there are, and I think Annie mentioned this as well, just that there is probably a greater concern now for journalists who work for us or for any foreign media who are Hong Kong nationals, mainland nationals, and you have to think differently about the risks that different people within your organization face. And so it's easy as a foreign journalist to sound a bit blasé and just worry about being kicked out. But we are mindful of risks that others in our organization and other organizations are taking, and the amount of time we devote to assessing those risks and our kind of understanding of those risks is a lot more significant than it had been probably when I started my job here.
Fascinating. Thank you, Annie, and thank you, Andrew. Clearly more to discuss there, but I think it just shows that the importance of continuing to discuss Hong Kong and elevating Hong Kong in the policy conversation here. So with that, I'll turn it back to my colleague, Scott, to conclude us for today.
Well, thank you, Lily, Jude, our colleagues at CSIS, who helped us with our research and with the report, and today's participants, Consul General May, Hanscom, Kelley, Annie, and Andrew. This has been a very valuable discussion to take the temperature of where Hong Kong is and where it's heading. And also thank you to the audience. Our report identifies an overall trend, which I don't think is surprising to most, but we also identify that there is a complex combination of resilience and erosion of autonomy, and also that Hong Kong is not static, that it is ever changing, which means that we will need to continue to pay close attention, both from a distance and on the ground, traveling to Hong Kong to talk to people in all facets of life there. Also, American policy options. There are no easy choices here, and we are going to probably need a combination of approaches in the coming years, and those will need to adapt according to what circumstances are on the ground. I want to thank again our guests, my colleagues at CSIS, and all of you for watching, wherever you are. Hope you have a great day.